Today, many churches, including my own and Martin's, will be listening to this account of the empty tomb and the events after Jesus' death. St. Mark's Gospel is certainly the shortest and probably the oldest of the Gospels, and we were both saying before we came on that it has a simplicity and a directness that remains attractive. You might not have the patience to read the Bible in a year, but anyone can tackle St. Mark in a couple of hours. Just because it's short doesn't mean it's unsophisticated, but there is about it a kind of primordial honesty too. In one of the countries that I worked in Africa, they didn't have one word for lies, but instead they would say too many words. St. Mark's Gospel does not use too many words. What he says is brief, direct, and honest. Reading Mark alongside other sources, we are also pretty confident that Mark is recording for us Simon Peter's view of Jesus' life and what he believed about Jesus. Throughout Mark's Gospel, we meet Simon Peter and we see him speaking up. When Jesus asks the disciples, "But you, who do you say I am?" it's Peter who boldly speaks up and declares, "You are the Christ." This puts him at the center of the expression of our faith too. But Peter also makes mistakes, and some of them very grave and bitter. If Mark is the earliest gospel, then the story of Christ's death and resurrection is the oldest part of Mark. And in that part, there is no doubt about how dark everything gets. Jesus is betrayed by one of his inner circle, Judas, with a kiss. When Jesus is arrested, Mark says, they all left him and fled. The next thing we see is Peter following Jesus at a distance as he is taken to the high priest's house. Is he going to intervene? Is he going to speak up for his friend? No. As soon as Jesus is condemned to death, Peter denies him 3 times. He hears the cock crow, he breaks down and weeps, and that's the last we hear about him until Easter Sunday. Peter, his closest friend, the one who said he'd never betray Jesus, along with everyone else, just didn't have the courage. So isn't it extraordinary that the young man at the tomb has a message that Jesus has risen and that the disciples and Peter will see him in Galilee, Peter, who talked the talk but couldn't walk the walk. The women, are they delighted by the news? Nope. The women are stunned, amazed, afraid, and Mark tells us that they run away too. So his gospel ends with fear and confusion and flight, a dark and uncomfortable ending. And yet, it's not the end. It can't be, because the message got passed down to us and it was put in writing. It's not the end because this gospel was written 30 years later, not as bad news, but as good news. Because what came after this is the early disciples, the early church, and a whole crowd of people who didn't deny the Lord, who didn't get scared, who didn't run away. That means the women and Peter and the disciples must have somehow been transformed completely by what took place next. And so Mark's gospel isn't something that actually ends in fear and despair. It's only the start of what happens next, our time, the time of the disciples of the risen Lord, the time of the church. And Simon Peter, who practically told this whole story against himself for 30 years, really did become the rock, Peter, that his friend and master Jesus said he would be. We stand on his faith and the faith of Mary Magdalene, the women and men who didn't run away, but whose lives were transformed by Easter and who passed on that good news to you and to me.